Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Doar, the president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I welcome you here to this important conversation about the state of America, of Black progress in America, with some distinguished guests who I'm very honored to welcome to AEI. I do want to make a couple observations in the beginning before we get started. Since becoming president of AEI, I've made addressing the state of Black America a priority for our institution. And I'm proud of the work we've done over the past few years. In 2022, we organized the Old Parkland Conference, which brought together prominent intellectuals and public leaders to address the biggest challenges facing Black Americans. And last year, we created a new Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility, which is dedicated to developing solutions that expand access to opportunity for all Americans. And for the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, we hosted a special forum here at AEI honoring Dr. King's legacy. Now, we have some distinguished guests here, but I want to speak for a moment about two AEI scholars who are not guests here, but are part of our community. And let me say about them that no scholars have done more to improve our work on these issues than Ian Rowe and Howard Husock. Ian's work on these issues is not just as an AEI scholar. He's an educator who's founded and run charter schools in New York City. He understands the power agency and opportunity can have to transform individuals and communities. And he's been taking his messages and experience to leaders across the country as part of AEI's Free Initiative. As a journalist, filmmaker, and scholar, Howard has been working on these issues for decades. Howard's work powerfully chronicles how government policies have undermined urban communities. And we're lucky to have both Ian and Howard at AEI. And I wanted to be here especially to introduce today's events to emphasize how important this work is and today's event is on the state of Black progress. So thank you for being here. Now, I'd like to finally conclude with one brief observation. And maybe this isn't completely in tone with the point of your presentations, which I know are going to be that in the United States, over the last 100 years, we've made great progress. And all Americans are doing well comparatively to the way they were in the past, especially Black Americans, who have shown great ingenuity and effort and drive and success. Every day they show that. But I want to remind us all of an observation Hubert Humphrey once said, that the measure of a society is how it treats its weakest members. When we're discussing the state of Black progress, we cannot lose sight of the fact that by this metric, the United States is the best country in the world. No other country provides its struggling people with more opportunities and more prosperity, which is why every year, millions from around the world continue to seek to come here. But let me stop and turn it over to the main attraction, T.W. Shannon and the rest of the group, and present their success with Cure. So thank you very much.
Robert, thank you. Robert, thank you for that kind introduction and those brief remarks. We're so grateful to AEI for opening their doors to Cure. My name is T.W. Shannon, and I am from Oklahoma. Greetings from the red state, and I am a former Speaker of the House for the state of Oklahoma and currently the Vice Chair for Cure. And it is an honor for me to be here to discuss this very important topic about the state of Black progress. This is a ongoing journey where we are chronicling the absolute success and challenges that face a particular minority group here in America. That is part of Cure's mission. Our founder, Star Parker, is with us, and I'm going to begin with some opening remarks to introduce to you those that sit on our panel today who you will be hearing from. Number one, we have Ian Rowe. Let me get those. And he is the founder of Vertex Partnership Academies and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Ian served for 10 years as CEO of Public Prep and has held leadership positions at Teach for America, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the White House, and MTV, where he earned 2 public service Emmys. With his recent book, Agency, Mr. Rowe seeks to inspire young people of all races to build strong families and become masters of their own destiny. Ian V. Rowe. Please give him a hand. Grace Marie Turner. She runs the Galen Institute, a public policy research organization founded in 1995 to promote an informed debate over free market ideas for healthcare reform. She has been instrumental in developing and promoting ideas to transfer power over healthcare decisions to doctors and patients through a more competitive, patient-centered health sector. Grace Marie testifies regularly before Congress and facilitates the Health Policy Consensus Group, a forum for market-oriented health policy experts to analyze and develop policy recommendations. Ms. Grace Marie Turner. Mr. Howard Husock is a senior fellow in domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on municipal government, urban housing policy, civil society, and philanthropy. Before joining AEI, Mr. Husock was Vice President for Research and Publications at the Manhattan Institute. He also has been a Director of Case Studies in Public Policy and Management at the Harvard Kennedy School, a member of the Board of Directors of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a journalist and Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker, and he is the author of several books. Mr. Howard Husock. And last but not least, Star Parker founded the Center for Urban Renewal and Education in 1995 and serves as president and CEO. CURE aims to fight poverty and restore dignity through scholarship supporting faith, freedom, and personal responsibility. Star is a presidential appointee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, California Advisory Committee, and joined the White House Opportunity Initiative Advisory Team in 2017 to share ideas on how to best fix our nation's most distressed communities. She hosts a nationally syndicated television program, Cure America with Star Parker, and is the author of several books. Ms. Star Parker. At this time, we're going to ask our honorees to give a 5-minute introduction of themselves and maybe a brief overview of what their topic was in the latest tome, The State of Black Progress. And first, we're going to begin with Howard, who will have 5 minutes for remarks.
Thank you very much, Speaker Shannon. It's really an honor to be on a panel convened here by Star Parker and CURE. Honored to be here with my fellow panelists. CURE does great work, and the State of Black Progress is another example of it, and I appreciate very much being invited to contribute to that. I'm going to talk about the following topic: how subsidized housing has harmed African Americans and what we can do to get out of that problem. It goes by many names: affordable housing, public housing, housing choice vouchers, Section 8, simply the projects. But all housing policies dating from the 1930s to the present day have been and remain, in my view, especially harmful to the interests of African Americans. Let me explain why. They have lured black households into dependency and long-term poverty, rewarded single parenthood, and especially led to the gnawing gap in home ownership and wealth accumulation between white and black households. Our housing policies have had all these deleterious effects in a series of ways, especially by destroying, demolishing, clearing black neighborhoods that were filled with black-owned businesses and homeowners, but were labeled as slums, replacing them with public housing projects where ownership is impossible and blacks are overrepresented, by setting housing rules there such that increasing income and marriage are punished, and by defining affordable housing as subsidized rentals rather than small, privately owned homes where ownership accumulates wealth. These unconsidered consequences date to the Roosevelt administration, Franklin, National Housing Act of 1937. The progressives of the New Deal were convinced that the private housing market was going to fail the majority of the population. Government had to step in and replace it with public housing. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt pushed especially hard for projects for African Americans, convinced that segregated neighborhoods of that era needed to be replaced. She even came to Detroit to cut the ribbon on the first public housing project named for Frederick Douglass. She was viewed as progressive because she was willing to include blacks in this alleged benevolence in the first place. But housing progressives utterly misjudged what they were replacing. Although we are often told that black neighborhoods were substandard areas owned by white slumlords, census data tells a different story. In Detroit, a neighborhood known as Black Bottom, that was for its original soil, not a racial comment, was home to no less than, this got cleared away, 300 black-owned businesses, a percentage, significant percentage of 1, 2, and 3 family homeowners, thriving branch of the Urban League and other self-help groups, and many churches, including the Bethel AME, led by C.L. Franklin, who had a famous daughter. All the effort that built Black Bottom aimed toward the goal of struggling towards self-improvement. But by 1950, all that was left was vacant lots, a highway, and high-rises which deteriorated so quickly they'd have to be demolished themselves. The same story of community destruction and high-rise replacements would play out in African-American neighborhoods all across the country. East Harlem, Central Avenue in Cleveland, DeSoto Tower in St. Louis, Bronzeville in Chicago. In St. Louis in 1950, 2 low-income, predominantly black neighborhoods, later cleared for public housing. There, 34% of housing was owner-occupied. An additional 9% were small multifamily structures where the owner lived on one of the floors. Similar numbers found in slums, quote unquote, in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. Owner occupants used their rental income to pay the carrying costs. Tenants aspire to own. They had an example of ownership right in front of them. The St. Louis neighborhoods I mentioned were cleared to make way for 2 high-rises, 23 stories each, the Pruitt-Igoe projects. They won an architectural award when they opened in 1956. By 1971, they were literally imploded in a cloud of dust because they were judged to be inhabitable. I'm at work on a new book about the history of public housing and looking particularly at some of these communities. And one of my favorite quotes comes from a columnist named Paul Jones, who wrote for the black newspaper in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Courier. He understood that not all the housing in the neighborhood called the Hill, which August Wilson made immortal in his plays. That's where all August Wilson's plays are set, the greatest American playwright of the 20th century. He understood not all the housing was great, but he had this to say in the Pittsburgh Courier. What about the churches, the schools, the business neighbor associations, civic groups? All these are part of the whole problem of uprooting the lives of many people whose patterns of living have been labeled not desirable, not acceptable, not endurable. People understood it at the time. Nobody asked their permission to tear down their neighborhoods. What could have been done instead? It was simply wrong to judge poor neighborhoods narrowly on the basis of their physical conditions. Anti-discrimination law would have helped rather than segregated public housing towers. But so too would have been help in restoring these neighborhoods rather than demolishing them. We needed to help create a new generation of owners building wealth. None of this would happen until the Fair Housing Act of 1968, by which time African Americans had long since been steered into the alleged reward of public and subsidized housing. Today, even as African Americans comprise 13% of the US population, they are 48% of public and subsidized housing. But isn't that a benefit? A way to reduce poverty? No, just the opposite. Consider the rules which govern public housing and its close cousin, Section 8 voucher housing, in which government pays the rent on a private apartment. First, how do you qualify? As the poorer you are, the higher the priority. And that means the poorest households of all single-parent households, almost always single mothers, they go to the head of the line. We're encouraging them to form in this way. Today in public housing, 4% of households are two parents with children, 4%. We all know the life prospects of low-income single parents and their children, and they're not positive. But even those who would seek to improve their lot are instead punished. By rule, subsidized tenants pay 30% of their income in rent. Might sound like a good deal till you look closely. It means when your income goes up, so does your rent. Would you sign a lease like that? It's not a ticket out of poverty, but a shackle. I use that word consciously. That keeps one in it. All this affordable housing, this government benefit remains a temptation, luring into dependency. The promise of physical comfort distracts from the struggle that leads to accomplishment and achievement. The fact that some projects are new and have yet to deteriorate should not distract us from their fundamental invitation to dependency. Here's a figure for you. The average time residents have spent in New York City public housing, 23 years. There are some residents who have lived their entire life in the project and passed their units on to the children. I've met them myself in Brownsville. The personal growth that comes with going to Home Depot, get the stuff you need to do the home repairs, they don't get to do that. They're taught to be supplicants, begging for basic services. So where does that leave us today? One thing, we need to change some of these rules. You need to be able to sign a lease with a flat rent, save money. We need to say, when you move in, we expect you to move out in 5 years. We want you to have a life plan, just like we have a time limit on cash welfare. We spend a lot less on cash welfare than we spend on public housing, but there's no time limit on public housing or subsidized housing. A signal that this is a transient, a temporary leg up would be the right signal as an intermediate step to disentangling the Black community from public housing and subsidized housing. We must signal to public officials that they need to stop doing anyone the false favor of trapping them in the gilded cage of subsidized housing. They need to ask what can be done to rebuild and restore neighborhoods, the ones that are marked by vacant lots and food deserts. History needs to be our guide. Rather than building high-rise apartments on those vacant lots, we need to make sure our local zoning laws permit the construction of homes that local residents can afford naturally. Because they're modest homes on small lots, starter houses, maybe 2 and 3 family, maybe places where you pay the mortgage by taking in lodgers. That's what people used to do. It gets celebrated in New York, the Tenement House Museum. That's what they did. We make a landmark out of it, but then we ban it. Some of these homes should have storefronts on the ground floors where grocery stores and barbershops can set up shop. I'm trying to paint a picture here of a real neighborhood where there are people on the streets and kids walking to school in safety, where wealth is created not by checks from the government, but through ownership and appreciation. We have, instead, I'm arguing, followed a housing path that has led to a dead end of impoverishment, especially for African Americans. We need to rethink and redo and get back, if you will, to the old-time ways that worked. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Thank you, Howard. It's a great honor to be here. And Howard, that was a great story about good intentions, but unintended consequences. And I think my essay, similar. On May 17th, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling that is considered by many civil rights activists to be the greatest judicial decision of the 20th century. In Brown versus Board of Education, the court addressed the issue that, quote, minors of the Negro race had been denied admission to schools attended by white children under laws requiring or permitting segregation according to race, end of quote. This decision nullified the precedent of Plessy versus Ferguson, which in 1896 had established the separate but equal doctrine that allowed the government to legally sanction racial segregation in public schools. Delivering the court's unanimous opinion, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote, quote, we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate but equal educational facilities for racial minorities is inherently unequal, violating the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, end quote. The landmark decision rightfully deemed schools that were racially segregated by order of law were, in fact, unconstitutional. This meant de jure segregation, meaning schools enforced by the government to exclusively educate white students only and mandatorily ban Black students because of their race. Those schools could no longer exist and would be punished if they violated the new ruling. Yet the decision also meant de facto segregation, meaning schools that had exclusively educated Black students on a voluntary basis, even though laws did not require it. These schools as well could not exist because the interpretation of the term inherently unequal carried with it devastating stereotypes of racial inferiority. Encapsulated in those two words, inherently unequal, is a noxious and racially reductionist principle that has for decades hindered America's quest for racial progress. Moreover, the lawyers argued and accepted as fact that segregation inevitably led to a, quote, sense of inferiority, end quote, among Black children. This was the predominantly accepted social science at the time. The Brown ruling essentially said that even if all other factors were equal, funding, adequate facilities, high-quality teachers, all Black schools were nevertheless seen by the court as inherently unequal, or more precisely, intrinsically deficient. Racially segregated schools, whether formed by legal mandate or community preference, were now treated with the same constitutional hostility by the court, and thus suffered the same fate of ultimate eradication. Rather than putting an end to forced racial segregation, the decision required that all white schools that heretofore had been segregated by law would now be forced to integrate by race, typically through busing Black students to white schools. However, all Black schools that had been segregated by choice were eventually forced to close, since they would now be deemed unconstitutional, even if those schools had superior academic outcomes. One such example is the erasure of one of the finest movements of Black excellence in education. 30 years prior to the Brown decision, Booker T. Washington was infuriated by the inferior conditions in which Black schools were operated. The segregation and disenfranchisement laws known as Jim Crow represented a formal, codified system of racial apartheid that dominated the American South. But Booker T. Washington was determined to change this and endeavored to build a new network of excellent schools that exclusively educated Black children. He joined forces with Julius Rosenwald, then the CEO of the Sears Roebuck Company. So imagine partnering today with the head of Amazon or Walmart, to give you a sense. Over the years, to construct these buildings, these schools, Rosenwald contributed $4.4 million, or what would be nearly $80 million today. And importantly, $4.7 million an additional $4.7 million came from local Black communities in the form of cash, labor, land, and materials. Washington and Rosenwald had launched a challenge grant program that had ultimately led to the unprecedented construction of more than 5,000 schools, 217 teachers' homes, and 163 shop buildings in 15 states from Maryland to Texas. The schools employed 14,000 teachers, providing classrooms for over a third of the rural South's Black school-age population, and therefore roughly a quarter of all Southern Black school-age children. Built between 1917 and 1932, the Rosenwald schools achieved dramatic academic gains for more than 700,000 Black children for more than 4 decades. Rosenwald alumni include the likes of Maya Angelou and Congressman John Lewis. Yet after the Brown decision, Ultimately, all of the Rosenwald schools were shut down. They were deemed unconstitutional, inherently unequal, and intrinsically deficient, simply because of the makeup of the student body that went to the school. As someone who has now run public charter schools in low-income communities in the Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan for the last 15 years, educating almost exclusively Black and Hispanic students, that is a perception that if it's all Black, it must be bad. That is a perception we have to continue to fight against. As the Supreme Court put it in 1954's Brown Board versus of Education ruling, quote, "It is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he or she is denied the opportunity of a quality education." The court described education as the very foundation of good citizenship and proclaimed that the opportunity of a quality education is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. The lessons of Brown teach us that neither does the presence of white students guarantee a high-quality education, nor does the presence of all Black students guarantee a substandard learning environment. Let's hope that the promise of those powerful words can be achieved regardless of the race of the students receiving that education. Thank you.
My glasses. Great.
Oh, aging's trendy. Everybody's doing it.
Good stuff, yeah. Hi, everybody. What a pleasure it is to be here today in this prestigious organization that has done so much over so many decades, the American Enterprise Institute, to educate the debate on a range of issues. And it's a pleasure to be here today with Howard and Ian and TW, and especially my good friend Star, who has done as much as anyone I know to really help inform the debate over how we need to get back to a different platform in helping the lowest income Americans to have part of the American dream, as Star herself says. And her visionary leadership really comes from her own education and her own childhood in being raised in a home of welfare dependency. And her goal with the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, which she founded how many years ago, Star? Yeah. To create policies that will transition America's poor to self-sufficiency. The panel of contributors to this book is Marty Dannenfelser would know how many contributors do we have? Several dozen contributors to the book. 12 contributors, and one of them is Sally Pipes, that I've worked with a lot on health policy. She is the president of the Pacific Research Institute, and we both have chapters in this book on healthcare. Mine is called The Dignity of Private Insurance. And I think you will find a theme here, and that is giving people choice and having the market respond to their need for choices leads to ownership, which accumulates wealth, as Howard said. I would argue that ownership also can accumulate health by giving people the choice and control over their health insurance. Studies have shown that too many politicians are making sweeping promises to Black Americans and others that they have government solutions that often relegate them to failing public programs, whether it's educational systems, housing, or healthcare. Studies have shown, for example, there is little difference in outcomes between patients who are on Medicaid and those who are uninsured. This is an insult to those who rely on public programs and often have no other alternatives. All Americans should be able to have the dignity of private insurance and not the promise of coverage that does not lead to access to care. Public programs often pay so little that doctors and hospitals have find it difficult to be able to take many patients on public programs. A friend of mine is a pulmonologist in Florida, and a good Catholic man who tries to take as many patients as he can on Medicaid. He said he had a patient with pretty complicated lung issues, and he spent, in the course of treatment, he said that he would have ordinarily been paid by private insurance $750 for that course of treatment. When he got the check back from Medicaid, it was for 6 cents. He said, there's just no way I can keep my doors open. And I have, since I have learned that story from him, I cannot tell you how many other physicians have said the same thing. So clearly, access to Medicaid is not access to health care. And instead of trying to micromanage our healthcare system from Washington, we need to transition to a new system that's more like school choice or housing choice. Consumers should be able to take the money devoted to their coverage in public and private programs to control and direct resources to the healthcare arrangements of their choice. And when they can do that, the market will begin to respond to their needs, not to figuring out how they can hire as many lawyers as possible to jump through all the hoops to make sure they're complying with government regulations. TW mentioned my work with the Health Policy Consensus Group. I'm pleased to have many scholars here at the American Enterprise Institute that participate in those conversations about how we can use markets, competition, freedom of choice to begin to provide better alternatives for people in accessing the health care that they need. The proposal would not only provide choice and access to health coverage, but it would provide better care, according to serious and significant modeling work that's been done, to those who need assistance because of age, disability, or economic conditions by providing dedicated resources to make sure their coverage is boosted, to make sure that their care is available. CURE explains in the foreword of the book, and as Star is going to speak to you in a moment, that misguided public policies and the normalization of victimization rhetoric have proven disastrous. By failing to live up to American ideals, our nation has denied many Black Americans their chance at the American dream. Being on Medicaid, being on the state children's health insurance program, even being on Obamacare programs, should not lock people into a lifetime of dependency and substandard access to the care they need. These are poorly performing government programs that politicians continue to pour more money into them without really getting to the key issue of how we make these programs better for people. CURE works closely with clergy, with community building ministries, and trying to bring together a diverse group of pastors, policy experts, and politicians to develop creative solutions for distressed zip codes. We are here and ready to continue to work with CURE to give people the dignity of private health insurance, the dignity of access to a quality education, the dignity of home ownership, and that will lead, as Starr says, to the freedom to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Star Parker, and I founded CURE, and I'm very appreciative to AEI for allowing for us to be here, to partner with us on the release of our second tome, The State of Black Progress. The first tome was published by Encounter a couple of years ago, but we received a letter from the Urban League to cease and desist using that name because they somehow had trademarked it and wanted to continue their discussion about Black America, that nothing has happened or worked in this country that they deem racist since the 60s. And so we thought a few years ago that we would put out an annual tome to counter some of those ideas, because America has worked very successfully for African Americans. And as some of the scholars have pointed out, there are pockets where we still need to place some attention, but most of those pockets are in trouble because of government intervention programs that started in the 60s and or in the 30s, and we hope that they will be corrected through new public policy. So I'm very, very grateful for the scholars here at AEI, some of them joining us. I think one of your colleagues is in the tome, The State of Black Progress, but is not here with us today. And as Marty pointed out, Marty Dannenfelser, who is the Vice President of Government Relations at CURE, that there are 12 scholars in this particular tome, which we're releasing now because it's Black History Month, but it won't be available for another month. So we would like for you all to pre-order and make sure that you keep up with the current discussions that we're debating in this book on where we should go from here when it comes to public policy. The first tome talked about the academic and historical look into the journey of Black Americans in this country. The second one looks more at the policy issues, as you've heard right now, about from whether it's housing policy, education policy, healthcare policy, and now I'm going to address Social Security policy. A recent Reuters headline read, in quotes, "Yellum Rights tout economics as key to fixing America's inequality," end quote. According to President Biden's domestic policy advisor, Susan Rice, end quote, "The evidence is clear. Investing in equity is good for economic growth," out quote. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said, end quote, "I believe economic policy can be a potent tool to improve society. We can and should use it to address inequality, racism," out quote. Well, to the extent that change in government policy can lift the median wealth of Black families, CURE thinks it is imperative that we push into this discussion with the Biden administration. According to the Federal Reserve's most recent survey of consumer finances, the median wealth of white families is about $180,000 compared with Black families at $24,000. So we at CURE are making the case that the word equity is an economic reality only realized through a capitalistic system where individuals can accumulate personal wealth, and that the most equitable way to bridge the wealth gap is to include low-wage and poor people into the phenomenon and miracle of compound interest by personalizing Social Security. In this tome, The State of Black Progress, economist Stephen Moore and former CURE senior policy analyst Raheem Williams take a deep look into our nation's Social Security program and then discuss reform options that could potentially increase Black wealth opportunities. Both argue that we should be giving working Americans the option to opt out of Social Security and divert their payroll taxes into their own personal retirement accounts. A big reason for the huge wealth gap between white and Black families is the huge stock gap in ownership of equities between white and Black families. According to Pew Research Center, 61% of white families have either direct or indirect ownership in stocks. Only 31% of Black families do. Per the Federal Reserve, among white Americans aged 35 to 54, 65% have at least one retirement account. Blacks in that same age group, only 44% do. While it is true that median Black household income is much lower than median white household income, meaning that Blacks on average have a lot less to save and invest, this is the very reason why giving the option to opt out of Social Security is so vitally important. Every working American pays 12.4% of their income into Social Security. Half is taken out of their paycheck, half is paid by their employer. The government then uses this tax revenue to recycle and make payments to those currently retired who themselves paid into the Social Security system through a payroll tax during their working life. Social Security, as the Supreme Court has ruled twice, is a tax. It is not an investment. And this tax is a hindrance for low-income earners to accumulate equity and build legacy. Per the Federal Reserve, 29.9% of white Americans say that they have benefited from inheritance and or some other family gift. Only 10% of Black Americans say that they have received an inheritance or some other family gift. Freedom and ownership are key to breaking the cycle of poverty and creating generational independence. And the opportunity to build wealth is one of the most amazing benefits of a free society. And it is capitalism that unleashes the economic potential of a people to become a safe and vibrant society. We believe that if the working poor were able to put their payroll tax into an IRA instead of sending it to the IRS, they wouldn't be so quick to hate and burn down Wall Street because they would own Wall Street. Capitalism is about building, creating, working, saving, owning. So we need to remove all public policy barriers that force workers to send their potential wealth building funds into a system where they have no ownership and they cannot transfer it to their heirs. Freedom is about taking responsibility for our individual lives, and this tome, The State of Black Progress, provides discussion on various public policy actions that we believe will help build an equitable, equality, and racial harmony in our society. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I've got a personal confession here. I had a birthday on Saturday. I turned 46, and I already forgot my glasses, and I have to have them now. So give me just a minute. I want to thank all of our essayists who contributed to the State of Black Progress. At this point, we're going to get into our Q&A session. If you have some questions, please queue them up, but I've got a couple of prepared ones that we'll go through first. But feel free to shoot. Let's hear your questions first. Yes, ma'am. In the back. You'll go with the ladies first, please. I'm from the South. I can't help it.
Wait for the microphone.
Please, someone's going to bring you a microphone. Just a second. But while we wait for the microphone, we'll start with you first. In your introduction to the State of Black Progress, you state that Black Americans have really arrived in the height of our cultural prominence in such areas as politics, entertainment, and academics. Yet many Blacks are suffering. There is still a deep-seated feeling among many Black Americans that we just don't have an equal opportunity to succeed in such areas as employment and education. Why is it that so many African Americans, in your opinion, are still suffering 60 years after passage of the Civil Rights Act and nearly 60 years after the enactment of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society agenda? Why are African Americans suffering still?
All right, two reasons, in my opinion. One, a government intervention in the 60s created an environment where we concentrated poverty into areas that now we consider distressed communities. There are 8,700 of them in our country out of a country of about 45,000 zip codes. So we know that 20% are sick. And the reason that they're so sick is because their political leadership keeps them sick. They have built a narrative that their problems are somebody else's fault. They built a narrative that they can't fix their own problems without government intervention. And most of the programs that they've created, as you just heard from the other panelists, are programs that actually keep you entrapped in those particular zip codes. There's many actions moving forward to try to release them from this dilemma that they were put into because of government action of the 60s coming out of the civil rights movement. But another reason, the second reason, is because Blacks have bought this narrative that they're the exception to the rule when it comes to progress. It's one of the reasons that at CURE we're pretty happy that we had to change the name because the the Urban League decided that they would have sued us had we not. Because Blacks have progressed. 75% of the Black community in our country, of African Americans, President Trump signed into law the Opportunity Zone Initiative, which unleashed a lot of prosperity all throughout the country. We saw for the first time in history, Black history, more African Americans over $75,000 a year in income than under $25,000 a year. So it's also the narrative that Blacks have bought into, that they are the exception to the rule when they're successful. So they continue to allow the left to dialogue out that America does not work for Black people.
What we know, and being on CURE's board for almost a decade now, is we know that capitalism works. We talk a lot about the 3 C's of capitalism, Christianity, and the Constitution. And they work for the general America, and they will certainly work for Black America. Ma'am, you had a question. Let's hear from you. Your name, please.
My name is Joe Freeman. My question concerns housing in cities.
Excuse me just a moment, Joe. I don't know that her mic is working, and we can hear her. Is it working? We're good? Okay. Joe, we're good.
Okay, I said my question concerns housing in cities, but by way of background, you can tell from my age, I spent 4 years in the civil rights movement, including a year and a half in the South, working for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, including time in 2 big cities, Birmingham and then Chicago. You mentioned unintended consequences. Are you familiar with Ted Lowy's work in the 60s?
Is that-
Major study of his hometown of Gadsden, Alabama, in which he pointed out that city officials used urban renewal money available from the feds to tear down
Yeah.
black slums,
Exactly.
sometimes by riding highways through them, but there are other means, and then a different batch of federal money to build the projects. The university saw it happening, but I didn't fully understand it until I took Lowy's course in graduate school. There weren't any unintended consequences. Why haven't we looked at the deliberate decisions made by city officials in the 50s and 60s to use federal money to tear down through urban renewal and then build up the projects?
Well, thank
Great
you for the
question.
question. I am trying to look at that in my new book, which is called The Projects, A New History of Public Housing, which will be published in the fall by NYU Press. It's not on par with the state of black progress, but I do try, Star.
It's good, and so is the poor side of town. And
Yeah, well, I
we need it,
appreciate
so
that.
continue.
But it's fascinating. I think the average person associates public housing with Chicago, New York, high-rises. Hundreds of small towns across the South have public housing authorities. And it's exactly for the reasons that you put out. Local officials and cronies, if you will, understood they could profit from these streams of income, both to do the demolition and the construction, appoint people to the housing authorities. And so they were lured into these unfortunate decisions by the presence of federal money. But public housing is all over small towns in the South.
No, you're absolutely right.
So, ma'am, hold on, we'll come back to you. I want to make sure we have enough time for everybody's questions. Howard, that actually is a great segue into a question I have for you. In your essay, How Public Housing Has Harmed Black Americans, Still Does, you provided many examples of government policies that frankly destroyed self-reliant black communities and small businesses by imposing really massive housing projects that, frankly, too often were dismal failures. You even pointed out that there were prominent Americans like Eleanor Roosevelt who truly believed these projects would benefit black Americans. That was the intent. They were well-meaning for sure. But maybe discussing this kind of hits on that question. What were those underlying flaws that maybe we missed, that even the most well-intentioned liberals, bleeding heart liberals who meant well for these poor blacks, what were the underlying flaws in those assumptions that they made about the communities, about the housing, and about the culture?
Well, there were so many. For one, housing projects don't have stores. I mean, it's a very simple thing. They're not real organic neighborhoods. All over New York, you can walk up Broadway in the Bronx, and suddenly there's a big gap in the retail on the street. What is it? It's a public housing project set off in a campus. And so there was a failure to understand what makes neighborhoods organic, spontaneous, street life. All of that was swept away by people who had no feel for what makes a good neighborhood. They mistook the physical conditions for the only thing that mattered. There were some houses that were in bad shape. That means, well, we got to get rid of those houses. Not realizing that, well, wait a minute, there were churches, there were, in famous places, famous nightclubs, the Crawford Grill in Pittsburgh. These are really famous places. Immortalized again, I'll repeat, August Wilson's work. It's amazing. This is the most famous playwright of the 20th century, and he immortalized a neighborhood that was torn down. That is crazy, And then there were some logistical policy issues that are really important to understand as we continue to build subsidized housing. Rents were originally supposed to cover the costs of maintenance. The government was not supposed to be in the maintenance business. There were going to be tenant rents, working people that would pay rents and they would maintain the buildings. Well, when working people got the chance to move to the suburbs, they did. The left behind were poor people whose rents were set at a low level, 30% of their income, and we starved these public housing authorities of the income they needed to maintain. They went downhill, and so there was compounded errors that eventually led into many of these being demolished themselves.
It's very interesting. Maybe as a follow-up, Howard, before we move to education, question about education, if if we can tangibly see that there were some inherent failures in these policies, in your opinion, why were they so pervasive? Why did they exist for so long? Why did we continue the cycle for so many generations, so many decades, if they were ultimately failing the
We're
community?
still
Any
doing it.
explanation there?
We're still doing it. We had a panel here the other day on the low-income housing tax credit. That's a whole new generation of quasi-public housing, and it has the same problem. It's all rental, no ownership. All rental, no ownership. Because we think that the housing market fails the poor, as opposed to what really happens when you have your own little house. One of my favorite examples, the houses in Levittown, New York, the ultimate New York or classic post-war suburb. People flocked to buy these houses after World War II. They were 700 square feet. Wow. 700 square feet. People put their money down. They built on top of those houses. They expanded them. They owned them. They sold them. That's the kind of housing we need. And instead, we put people in these rental apartments and they get trapped in them. And we're still doing that.
Very insightful. Moving to education, Ian, your insightful essay in the State of Black Progress, you said that the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education really had the unfortunate effect of erasing what is a beacon of Black excellence in education, particularly as it related to the Rosenwald schools that were so successful in educating probably more than 700,000 Black children over 4 decades. What, in your opinion, were the lessons that we can extrapolate from that tragic development and apply them to decisions about educating Black children today and maybe even in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me make clear that Brown versus Board of Education correctly decided to end the practice of legally segregated
Absolutely.
schools. It was the execution that was the problem, because the execution went further than that. It went further to say, if schools are separated by race, for the Black kids, that's inherently unequal, and as I said, intrinsically deficient. So that then led to the elimination of these nearly 5,000 schools. So one lesson, first of all, is not to make the assumption that simply differences in race determine whether or not schools should have the right to exist. Again, I run public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan. We don't have any white students, and it's not as if we're waiting, suddenly we need for white students to show up for our schools to suddenly now be successful. So that's a fundamental thing. But more importantly, are we actually focused on the right problem? If you look at the data from the National Assessment for Educational Progress, often called the nation's report card, in 2015, they did the analysis of reading levels for Black students. And at that time, they identified in 2015 of Black 4th grade students, 18% were reading at NAEP proficiency levels, right? 18% of Black 4th graders in 2015. 4 years later, if you look at that data from 2019, now that same cohort of what were 4th graders, now 8th graders, of that group now only 15% was reading at grade level at 8th grade. Fast forward to 2023, if you look at the same data, all indications are that less than 20% of Black students, now seniors, are reading at grade level. And yet, we clamor around race-based affirmative action. The issue that these students face is not the lack of race-based affirmative action to get into college, it's that they're not prepared far before getting there in the first place. So it's aligning where the issues are with where we see what are the true driving factors of whether or not a kid's going to be successful or not. And I want to just come back to Star's point about wealth. You correctly said the latest data, I guess, is that white families, or the average wealth is about $180,000 for white students, and about $24,000 for Black families. The similar data in 2019, there's about $160,000 gap in wealth between white families outpacing Black families. But if you just take into account a few other factors, like family structure and education, that $160,000 gap is completely reversed when you take the average married Black family, college educated, their average wealth is about $160,000 more than the median wealth of a white single-parent family. So we have to understand what are the factors that drive good outcomes in housing, good outcomes in education, good outcomes in amassing wealth. They have much more to do around factors like family structure, married two-parent households, access to high-quality education in the K-12 experience, usually a commitment for religious faith. Those are the factors that we know for the segments of the Black community that are flourishing. Those are the pillars that they are embracing that most explain that success.
Another pillar, if you have an education question, please raise your hand and someone will bring you the mic. In the meantime, though, you mentioned those pillars, and we know that the pillar of any society is character. And I know in your Vertex Partnership schools in the Bronx, you put a strong emphasis on character formation as well as educational excellence. And in your book, Agency, I know you really seek to inspire young people of all races, really, to build strong families, as you mentioned, to become masters of their own destiny. Talk to us about how those approaches resonate where you've had a firsthand opportunity to see the fruits of their implementation. How does character matter, and what are the results you've seen as a result of that?
Yeah.
And I think there was a question up here on the front row for education, if someone wants to bring the mic while we wait.
Sure. Well, there's no question, our school, any good school should be focused on ensuring students have access to the greatest work of art, music, literature, poetry, mathematics, sciences. So that's very important that we focus on academic rigor. And also within that, we are telling kids about some of the biggest decisions they need to make, such as things related to family structure. It is still the case that among married Black couples, the poverty rate is in single digits. So it's always important to reify that. But on top of all of this, a virtues-based education, in my view, is the undergirding of a successful and a meaningful life. At our school, we are organized around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom, and we give meaning to those virtues. And by the way, the cardinal virtues come from the Latin word cardo, which means hinge. So all other standards of moral excellence are built off of those 4 cardinal virtues. But our I statement for courage is I reject victimhood and boldly persevere, even in times of uncertainty and struggle. Or temperance, I lead my life with self-discipline because I am responsible for my learning and behavior. These are words that our students learn in their head and then ultimately learn it in their heart as a way for how they live their lives. So to the degree that education can have this focus on a solid, traditional liberal arts education, which stresses the importance of strong family formation in addition to academics, it also has a deliberate effort to the moral formation of our students.
And you mentioned that victimhood and this social media culture that we live in, victimhood has become such a currency for exchange because the minute you proclaim you're a victim, you get an immediate culture, you get an immediate community that surrounds you. And so I'm so glad to hear that you're fighting that directly in those Vortex charter schools. Sir, please give us your name and state your question.
Mr. Rowe, the high-performing school in Denver, DSST, is also centered around virtue and values. I've been involved in DC's charter school movement from the beginning. I've served on 3 charter school boards, president of 2 of them. If we look at the test scores of students, and I was going to comment, they're very similar to what you brought up, we're not seeing an increase in scores as we might have predicted from giving parents choice. The schools have improved, there's no question about that, especially the traditional public schools through competition, they've gotten better. But why aren't we seeing the results that we thought we would see? Is this experiment really not working?
No, it's a good question. Why, or when you're talking about public charter schools in particular, it is true that not every public charter school is great. There's some public charter schools that are incredible and fantastic. And by the way, There's some very strong traditional district schools as well. What the public charter schools, though, in my view, offer to most families, especially in challenging conditions, so for example, the high school that we just launched in District 12 in the Bronx, in 2015, of the 2,000 or so students that started ninth grade, 4 years later, only 7% graduate from high school ready for college, meaning that they start ninth grade and they drop out somewhere along the way, or they actually do earn their high school diploma, but still cannot do math nor reading without remediation if they were to go to college. And in this district and throughout New York City, there's a ban on charter schools. So if you had an idea to actually create a compelling option for parents, you couldn't do it. The only reason we were able to do it, we had a very clever idea, and even us to start a high school, the teachers union sued us to try and shut us down before opening. So it is still the case that we're not yet seeing enough opportunity or enough choice across the country. But to your point, not every charter school is great, but what we should have is an accountability structure so that if there is a charter school that's not performing well, it actually will be closed. Those schools I'm talking about in District 12, it's been 7%. This didn't just happen last year. This has been happening for generations. And so traditional district schools they're tolerated. This kind of underperformance is tolerated. And so in my view, what a public charter school environment at least creates is the more opportunity for choice and a system of accountability if the schools are not performing.
The soft bigotry of low expectations. Star, you had a comment there.
I wanted to comment on this as well, because one of the challenges we're also confronted as we're promoting options in education, educational choice, regardless of what that scenario looks like, and how effective charters moving into communities that need educational options the most are working through the scenario of what has also happened with the expansion of the welfare state. We now have a society of irresponsibility, if you will. We have people that really believe that the country is stacked against them, and in a secular environment where as a nation, we cannot even agree that there are absolute truths, then the weakest link gets broken down even more so. And so once the student comes to that environment, even if you're giving them the best of academic opportunity in a charter, which is far better than the public school system, if their home life is not intact, if they're getting only information that they will never make it in a society that's inherently racist, then you're dealing with that element as well. So I didn't want to ignore the cultural component to why some of our charter experiences are lagging, if you will. It's not just that they're not providing quality education, as the left and the teachers unions will pretend to say that it was a bad experiment in the first place. We have to do like you do a stick shift car. You got to press on the gas and lift off the clutch at the same time. So while we're improving educational options, we must also improve our culture.
Well said. And what we're really talking about, it sounds to me, whether it's housing, education, and certainly as we move into healthcare, is really a culture war between philosophies and worldview. You know, you either have a secular humanist worldview, or you really have the Judeo-Christian worldview that has really, been the foundation of America, meaning you believe that every person you meet was created within the image of God. And that means that every person, every child, regardless of skin color, deserves a certain level of treatment, fair treatment, and even a certain level of recognition of them as a person. But, I was in the legislature from 2007 to 2014 when I became speaker. And I will tell you, Grace Marie, that was the time when we saw Obamacare enter the scene. And I can tell you, in the reddest state in America, conservatives, we were caught completely flat-footed when it came to healthcare as really a political tool. The left mastered that in a way that we were unprepared from a messaging standpoint, and we got our clocks cleaned, and we're still suffering results. But in your essay, The Dignity of Private versus Public Insurance, you've argued that the political left really has a disguised agenda, and they see Medicaid as the platform upon which to build their government-run healthcare system. What is behind the left's desire to do this, and what would be really the ramifications if they achieve that objective in full totality? Yeah. And some may argue they already have.
Well, they're very close. about 80% of all healthcare is either controlled directly or indirectly by government. So we are, it's Mark Pauly in an essay for the American Enterprise Institute said there's not a lot left of the unfettered marketplace that people talk about. But there's the themes that I think we're seeing here across the panel and throughout this book really are something that conservatives have been working on for decades. I had the good fortune to work with Steve Forbes when he was running for president in 1996 and also 2000. And to Social Security, he said that if a person who started out in a minimum wage job and worked the equivalent of a minimum wage job through their whole career, obviously there would have been increases from a 75% now. He said that person, if that money had been invested in the market in just a regular CD over the course of his life, would have held $1 million in the bank when he retired. And this was in 1996. So much more today. So the dignity of giving people access to the money that politicians are using to buy votes, frankly, I think is really, really so important. And that, unfortunately, that's what happens in healthcare, is that you find that politicians will say we've got to reduce the uninsured rate, not the access to care rate, the uninsured rate, and giving people access, so they increase the number of people, and dramatically during COVID, on Medicaid. 90 million Americans are on Medicaid. And that is a huge portion of our society that are on a public program that may pay a doctor 6 cents to see a patient. So why do they go to hospital emergency rooms? Because that may be the only place they can get care. It's not coordinated care. It's sporadic. It's only sort of getting you through that crisis, not providing the continuity of care that you need in order to be able to actually maintain health. So the stories about being able to increase access to Medicaid prevail over the stories of, like, my physician friend in Florida that's paid 6 cents for seeing a patient, and all the patients who have to sometimes spend weeks, if not months, trying to find a physician to see them, especially for specialty care. So the political dynamic really is working against the individual person on the Medicaid or Children's Health Insurance Program and being able to access care. And if that person were able to have the value of the subsidy that they're eligible for and be able to buy a private plan, they would have many more choices. And we actually have an example of how that worked in the Medicare prescription drug benefit plan. When it was originally created in 2003, went into effect in 2006, patients had the option of choosing from a range of prescription drug plans that were all competing for their business, because they had a subsidy that was following them as a person. They made sure that they had a plan that covered the drugs that they're on, with 150 drugs, with 2 per class, to make sure that if there were drugs they would need in the future that they didn't know they needed were also going to be covered. That program is one of the only government programs that has come in dramatically under budget, and it has a 97% popularity rate. People love it because it gives them choice, it gives them dignity of access, and the marketplace is competing for their business, not to jump through all the hoops to make sure they're complying with government regulations. That's what we need more of across the board in all of these issues.
You mean to tell me that free markets work? Who knew? It's amazing. I think about it often. We have other real life examples too that aren't even as complex. I think about cosmetic medicine, which has just exploded over the last few years. Not only has it gotten more available, not only is there more access, but it's also gotten more affordable because of competition. People, if they're getting a little work done, they'll call around, they'll figure out what the pricing is, they'll drive to a different state. They certainly, LASIK surgery is another great example. The costs go down and actually safety goes up. Is there someone with the healthcare question? As you bring the mic, we'll go there. But you might also, Grace Marie, talk to us about, one of the things I appreciate in the dignity of private versus public insurance that you talk about, there is a distinction between the discussion of health care and health. Sometimes there's not a link between the two. Government likes to spend more money and say we're providing more health care, but the question becomes, are we getting healthier? And what are some examples have you seen where these free market ideas have actually made the society healthier, or vice versa? Where have you seen where these government-run, non-free market ideas have made us less healthy? Is that clear?
It is. Let me give you an example of a program in New York City. I think New York University Hospital decided it was having so many patients with diabetes that were coming in with ulcers and with serious problems with their diabetes. And they said if we could only help people before they get here in the emergency room, we could avoid this. We know how to measure their A1C levels. We know how to be able to treat somebody in advance. So they set up a program to be able to do outreach for diabetic care. And it was dramatically helping people to be able to, and this was actually supported by private philanthropy, so it's the private part, to help people be able to get early care. There were some partnerships with pharmaceutical companies and pharmacists. If you go in to see your pharmacist, he can check your A1C levels, he can do diabetic checks, and you'll get your meds for free if you go see the pharmacist. So you don't have to take time off from your job to go get this. So you were beginning to see enormous successes of this. They shut it down because the hospital was losing money because people weren't as sick and coming in. So, we have got to dramatically change the incentives across the board because private enterprise, the virtuous heart of Americans to help the least fortunate is there, but it's just blocked by all these government rules or regulations, and particularly payment policies that are so adverse to the outcomes we want.
It's one of the.
I'd just like to add,
Please.
I've seen maps, what I call the diabetes belts in New York City, and they are coincident with minority neighborhoods in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, in East Brooklyn. Diabetes belts, you just don't see it in Midtown Manhattan, but you see it in minority neighborhoods.
Well said. There was a question was it a question for Grace Marie? Please.
George Pendleton, 3 questions, yes or no. One, is it the case that if your doctor who's making 6 cents on a Medicaid patient, doctors who are making 6 cents on the Medicaid patients, are doctors who treat poor and Medicaid patients still paying a higher premium, a malpractice premium, because of the patients that they treat? Is that factoring into their business model? Secondly, do you think, there's a Hill report that says that Black Medicaid patients are being brought into hospitals for what are preventable diseases. Should the HHS Office of Civil Rights investigate why that might be the case, that that segment is being admitted for things that arguably are preventable? And
now you sneaked in 2 questions on me.
One more. They're all kind of related because they're related to what he just mentioned. Do you believe that a significant reduction, say by half, of type 2 diabetes could also correlate with a reduction in poverty?
Those are good questions, and I think you know the answers. So I've never heard that about whether or not a physician's medical malpractice insurance premiums are higher if they actually treat patients on Medicaid. I don't know that, but I'll find out. It's actually more difficult to sue if you're on Medicaid because you don't own the policy and you don't have a contract with the government. Yeah, right. So I'm going to look into that. That's a really interesting question. Roger Severino was head of the Office of Civil Rights during the Trump administration at the Department of Health and Human Services, and he really did a lot to try to use that office to help shine a light on how government policies are adversely affecting the poor and minorities. And I think that's a really good question. But then there's a big effort now underway to put together the so-called 2025 agenda of things that a new administration could do to address a lot of these issues. So I'm going to mention that to him as well, to see if looking into the disproportionate number of babies born in hospitals that from minority families, that minority mothers that have adverse health effects. Is that the question? And what can be done about that?
It was broader.
Yeah.
Black Medicaid patients in general are being brought into hospitals for diseases
Yeah.
and predicaments that are preventable.
Yeah.
So somewhere in the pipeline.
Yeah. I'm taking that to these. Yeah, I'm going to take that to these groups because those are really, really good questions to ask. We need to know the answers, and especially we need solutions. So thank you.
I think there was another question for regarding healthcare on this side of the room, please. Yes, ma'am. And one up front, too.
Somewhere in that ballpark.
Uh-oh.
All right, sorry about that. So give a little context first. So I'm actually engaging in work right now.
Tell us who you are.
Jane Doe.
Yes, ma'am.
No, it's Shanice Kelly. I'm engaging in work on my family. I'm doing research, intergenerational research across 5 generations of my family and looking at working class family, Black family from the American South. And so my interest is around family identity, literacy, and success. And so one of you all were talking about home life being intact in that role. When I think of family, I think about family systems in the same way we have a government that is a system, we have a family which is a system. The system is designed to protect itself. And so my work living abroad in different places has informed that. That's what drew me to the study. So earlier, I believe Star was saying that we're doing well. There was a juxtaposition of how the family median income of a white family is $180,000, $24,000 for a Black family. I think about when I hear that, the reality of that, I want you all to talk a bit about how the notion of exception versus rules in relationship to your lens or expertise, how that plays into collective agency. And I say that because earlier there was talk about the busing, all these separate and kind of siloed approaches in different pockets around the country. Where have you all seen that play out in your work in terms of the exception, this Black exception to the rule, or this one, those chosen ones, or that student, get bussed out or has a choice, and how that plays out when you're thinking in collective work, and how this plays out around agency and avoiding victimhood. And I think about epigenetics and how we pass on these things.
Star, why don't you try that? And I think, Howard, you may have some thoughts on that,
I
too.
might have some input on that question too, especially regarding busing and other experiments that were tried throughout history of trying to build a what some call equal playing field. But on the question of income inequality, if you will, on wealth, that we were looking at that point on wealth, not income. And it is true, as Ian has pointed out, that when you have family life intact, whether it's a Black family or white family, if it's a traditional order in that household, husband married to the mother, the children, with work involved in that particular family life, it's almost immeasurable, the poverty rate difference. So it's not ethnic policy that's driving this dilemma. It is actually family and culture. When it comes to the wealth gap, the argument that we are trying to make through CURE and then we explore in the State of Black Progress is why we have such a big gap. What are the saving policies in a household? What are the opportunities in a household to be able to save and invest in the country, if you will. I mean, when we think about index funds, this is the country, this is the stock market. And we also look at what is driving the disdain, in particular from Black people, to want to mainstream their lives and become a part of a healthier society, including accumulating wealth. Where we see the difference is in income. Income of Black Americans, generally speaking, is lower than income of the majority community. So there's not as much opportunity to save and invest, as well as family structure is very different. And when you don't have legacy or pass on, as I mentioned in my open remarks, that we have, if you don't have that generation that has passed on, then you're going to also see some of these differences, which is why we're making the case, if you will, that we need another way for low-income people to gain wealth, for independence. And that other way could be to put a portion of their payroll taxes into the marketplace, into a personal retirement account. So that's the discussion that we should have in African-American communities, but as well as in our general society, to say, how do we break the cycle of poverty and government dependency? And building wealth is one way to not only break the cycle of poverty and build wealth, but it also will break down some of these racial discussions that we keep having to have over disparity. When you own it, you take care of it.
And did you have a thought on that too? Howard, I'm going to come to you, but I'm going to come to you with this lady's question. I promised her I was going to come back to her since she got 3. So,
Yeah, I would just say I think the framing of your question was interesting. This idea of the exception to the rule, because I think for many people who look at progress in the Black community, they say the rule is that, you know, America's an oppressive nation and the system is rigged against you. And so any exceptions, like we say, Black families, married Black couples, you know, have single-digit poverty rates, those are exceptions that are just ignored. And I think that's a very dangerous error, because they're not exceptions. Those are opportunities to understand if success can be achieved in these situations, why cannot that be replicated for the much larger population? So if we understand that the vast majority of people of any race finish just their high school degree, then get a full-time job of any kind, just so they learn the dignity and discipline of work, and then if they have children, if they got married first, if 97% of millennials who follow that, of any race, follow that series of decisions, avoid poverty, and the vast majority they enter the middle class or beyond, or those numbers are 91% within the Black community, then maybe there's something there. It's not just an exception to be ignored, it's success to be replicated.
very good. This gentleman here had a question, then I'm going to come to the lady here, and then we're going to close out our remarks. We're getting close on time. I've got about 9 minutes.
Anyone on the panel can answer
Please
this.
introduce yourself, sir.
My name is Bill Mower. I'm running for Congress across the river in Arlington, Virginia. And why do the Democrats seem to get a pass for creating these systems that hold back progress in these challenged communities?
Who'd like to take that?
Well, I'll take the first crack. I think because the ostensible benefit presented in legislation makes it hard to say it must be bad, must be deleterious. Head Start's a great example. Who doesn't want to give a child a head start? Right? But there have been 9, maybe it's 10 now, serious studies about the efficacy of the Head Start program. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's kind of a babysitting program, most of all. And the gains that are made tend to wash out by the 3rd grade. I shouldn't be talking about education, so I'll stop pretty soon. But my point here is the framing, the Affordable Care Act, brilliantly framed, Head Start, brilliantly framed. And so marketing has had a lot to do with it, I think.
Excellent.
And I would just add, I think a lot starts with what your worldview is and what the underlying assumption, right? So if you look at the racial wealth gap, you say whites are earning this, have this amount of wealth, $160,000 more than Black families. Well, that's due to systemic discrimination. If the racial achievement gap in reading where white kids, 47% of white kids are reading and only 18% of black kids are reading, well, that's racial discrimination. If you look at all this data and your monocausality, if your single purpose, single explanation for all of these things must be structural bias based on that dimension, whether it's race or gender, then you will come up with a completely different set of interventions that have nothing to do with what I think more conservative folks come up with, which are more bottom-up factors like family structure, faith, culture, access to high-quality education. And that's where it often seems to be the divergence in the interventions that are placed forward.
I'm sorry, I've got to move on, Mark. I want to hear from this young lady, and if we have time, this gentleman here, please. Okay, excellent. Well,
You were going to say something?
this question.
Thank you. My name is Femi Akimbi. My question is regarding the wealth gap. I think in the U.S., we have few issues that needs to be addressed. One, the issue of the homelessness and the mental illness is combined together, and that's a problem. Second, we are aware that when black people are looking for finance for mortgage, we're the last to get it. When we are trying to appraise our properties, it comes way lower than the white people. And my question then to us is, if our issue is the area of real estate where we could finance, own it, and then have the equity to develop our own community, why is it that the system haven't come up with something, a program where we could put X amount of money for those who are not very privileged in the real estate environment? And secondly, how do we make sure that those who get the house could keep them? My suggestion is, if that does not get done by the government, I think the African American well-to-do community should set up a fund of their own to back the mortgage system. Your take, please. Thank you.
Sound like a housing question to me.
Well, I think it's.
Well, I'm just going to jump in here and say, I would challenge the premise that blacks are not getting mortgages. In fact, I think one of the problems is we have a solution to that called the Community Reinvestment Act, where you can be underqualified and get the mortgage, and that's a disservice to people who get into houses and then get delinquent in their rents. Savings is the key. And so if there was a time, and there was, when the government was denying government-insured loans to black people, it's a great book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which is about that. It wasn't the banks doing it, it was the government encouraging them to do that. Right. So let's not look to the government to fix that. I like your idea of well-to-do black people founding a mortgage fund. That's a great idea.
Excellent.
I want to say in conclusion that.
Last comment, Star.
And appreciate all of you participating in this discussion on the state of black progress. It's one of the reasons that we've come up with this tome. It will be available within a month, and we can have that conversation again, including if we get out of here on time, AEI might let us come back and continue, because you've brought up quite a few discussions that are continuum in black communities, if you will, in all of America, including on homelessness. We've actually done a study on that. You may want to visit our website, curepolicy.org, to look at our ideas concerning this massive challenge that we're confronted with. But I hope that you will all leave with appreciation that at least we're having these discussions, because the reason that we came up with this tome is because from the progressive left, we only hear one side of the story, and we only hear then one solution offered to actually alleviate the pain, and that's big government. And for the last 60 years, we've tried that approach, and nothing works on that side. So thank you and appreciate your questions, and thank you, TW, for letting me give another plug to our tome.
You mean I had a choice? Let's give our panelists a hand. AEI President Robert Doar notes in his open letter on the AEI website that AEI defines its work as promoting its core values: free people, free markets, and limited government. CURE's mission is to apply these same core values to specifically address issues of race and poverty. When Star Parker founded CURE 25 years ago, her motivation was to fill the vacuum of dealing with public policy as it affects low-income Americans, to show that what poor Americans need is to get those core American values into their daily lives. This was in great contrast to what had become the dominant thinking about meeting the challenges of race and poverty. That dominant thinking then, which unfortunately still very much continues today, was that freedom was not the answer to our challenges of race and poverty, but what was needed was more government. In 1964, the year of the Civil Rights Act, it became law. Federal spending consumed a little more than 17% of our domestic product, GDP. Today, it hovers around 25%. This is a great and sad irony. It really was that rallying cry of the civil rights movement was about freedom, about bringing American freedom to communities denied core American values and principles. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in concluding in his famous speech in 1963, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. We at CURE believe that the issue of race continues to haunt our nation today because of the failure to follow up the 1964 Act, which aimed to assure all Americans equal treatment under our nation's laws with an agenda of freedom. With the new protections afforded by the 1964 Act, it should have been a fresh moment for individual empowerment and freedom. But political leaders, rather than ushering in a new birth of freedom guaranteed by the Civil Rights Act, ushered in a new birth of government instead. This served and is currently serving neither low-income Americans nor America at large. The real distinguished scholars which have contributed to CURE's State of Black Progress, some of whom we've heard from today, they've looked at major areas of American policy: housing, healthcare, education, and retirement savings. They have become tools for more government with the alleged goal of advancing opportunity and social justice. That's why we're gathered here. That's why CURE exists. The State of Black Progress will be out in a month. Please get yours pre-ordered. Thank you, AEI, for having us, and we look forward to sticking around and answering any questions you may have as well. Thank you. And I will note it is 2:30 on the dot.